Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along today for the Modern Slavery PEC's webinar on our latest call on prevention of modern slavery. Today in this webinar we're going to be looking at two elements of the funding call on the identification of children and on cultural competencies. Just going to kick off with a bit of a welcome and some housekeeping. So my name is Izzy Templar. I'm the Research Operations Manager at the Modern Slavery PEC, and you'll be hearing from my colleague Alex throughout today's presentation. All participants are on mute with videos off at the moment, but please feel free to post questions throughout today's webinar using the Teams Q&A function. So if you're not familiar with that, you should be able to see it in the top bar of your screen. So we're not using the chat today, we're using the Q&A because it just allows us to moderate the questions that are coming through. If you're having any technical problems at all, so if our audio isn't working, you can't hear us, or any issues like that, please post that in the Q&A and we'll pick those up and we'll try to respond to those as best we can. However, we're also recording today's webinar and we'll share it online afterwards. We're going to record the entire webinar, including the Q&A section, but we won't be posting the Q&A online. The Q&A is just going to be for our note-taking purposes that we'll be recording that. We'll cut off the recording at the end of our presentation. We'll post it online, but we'll collate all of the questions that have been asked along with ones which are asked by email into an FAQ document and put those on the call webpage. So everything will be recorded somewhere. So just to start off, we use meeting rules at the Modern Slavery PEC, and we just ask that everybody who attends our meetings follows these. I should hopefully have posted those into the Q&A now, a link to those so you can have a look at them on our website. In essence, the aim of these is to make sure that all of our meetings are a safe space for people who are participating, including being a safe space for those who have lived experience of modern slavery being able to participate in our work. So we mainly are asking everyone is sensitive and respectful, listens to different points of view, uses their language thoughtfully, and also looks after yourself. So if you feel that you need to take a break, anything like that, you're more than welcome to do so. We'll be enforcing those rules in today's meeting, so if anybody does breach those, we'll ask you to leave the meeting today, but hopefully that won't be an issue at all. On to our agenda for today. So we're going to start off with an introduction to the Modern Slavery PEC and give an overview of the two research topics that we're discussing today from the prevention call. Then we'll be going through the application process and we'll be having our Q&A at the end. So I will hand over now to Alex, who'll be giving you an introduction to Modern Slavery PEC.
Thanks, Izzy. So welcome everyone. My name's Alex Bolch. I'm Director of Research at the Modern Slavery PEC. As Izzy said, I will be taking you through what the PEC is and how we operate, how we fund research, and then I'll give you a brief introduction to two funding calls. So to begin with, what is the Modern Slavery PEC? We are a policy and evidence centre that has been set up to enhance understanding of modern slavery across the globe and to transform the effectiveness of laws and policies. So we're interested in improving the quality of research and evidence and then getting that evidence into the hands of the people who make decisions. So we're more than just a funder in the sense that we get involved in the research itself. We manage research projects as cohorts, so we might have 3, 4, 5 or 6 projects on a similar theme, and we take advantage of that by bringing those research projects together, sharing information between them, enabling bridge building. So we're really interested in building bridges between researchers, academics and non-academic types of research, to think about different types of evidence, particularly evidence from people with lived experience and projects led by people with lived experience. So we're really about promoting collaboration, bringing people together, but also connecting those two worlds of research and policymaking. We have 3 guiding principles that really drive all of our research, and these were developed through a consultation process. And there's something we reflect on regularly when we develop calls and when we select projects for funding. And that is the alignment with these principles, first of all, of effectiveness. So how is the research telling us about what works, what is effective, what is most effective, and for who when it comes to policies on modern slavery. Secondly, equity. We know that modern slavery is a phenomenon that is really closely connected with structural inequalities and structural injustice. But we also know that our own funding system can be unfair. So we think about equity in two different ways, really. One in terms of the topic itself, but secondly in terms of how we conduct our research, how we fund it, how we bring partners in fairly, and how we make sure that everyone is properly compensated for their time. And that brings us to the third principle, which is survivor involvement, including people who are most affected, and doing that fairly and doing it non-tokenistically. And that means compensating. It means putting in sufficient time in research projects to involve people properly in all aspects of the research. So that's it for the overview of the PEC. I'll now turn to the two research calls that we're going to talk about today. The first one of them is identification of children. And each of these research calls, were developed from a gap or a need for new evidence that we have detected or been told about through our sort of regular consultation with policymakers and researchers. So this area of identification of children as potential victims or in terms of at risk of modern slavery is something that we've been told about by policymakers, by researchers, by practitioners. So this project has the aim to improve our understanding of how children are identified, but also to improve our understanding of what's best in terms of prevention, what works best in terms of preventing exploitation and re-exploitation, including missing episodes. Why do children sometimes go missing from care or services? So the scope is limited to children and young adults. So that means up to 25 years old in the UK who have experienced or are at risk of modern slavery. And that does include county lines or child criminal exploitation, such as county lines. So what we're interested in is, what initiatives are there out there that identify and prevent exploitation of children? How are they working? And then what sort of new evidence can we create to help us understand better what works to prevent child trafficking? So we have a series of objectives. Now, these were sort of co-developed with policymakers and with our existing researchers. So we sort of talk to people about what are the best ways we feel that the evidence should be sort of targeting. And these objectives run into two slides. So I'll start with the first slide. The first one is, as I mentioned before, it's about what interventions and what initiatives currently exist to support early identification of children. How are those working? How can we assess them properly? So what are the best ways to assess those initiatives? And how can we include those principles I mentioned about equity and inclusion of people with lived experience in those assessments? So that's the first objective. Secondly, how is identification currently working? So how are children currently being identified as victims of trafficking and modern slavery? By which agency, by which frontline service, and how is this being integrated into broader safeguarding approaches? So we might think about, why are some people being missed? Where is there good practice in terms of early identification? So the second slide on objectives is about thinking about causal arguments. So for objectives A and B, why are certain interventions and patterns occurring? Can we trace this to differences in age, gender, nationality, exploitation type, or geography? In terms of different parts of the UK where perhaps different practices are more prevalent, or where particular responses have been developed. And then D is to develop evidence-based recommendations for policymakers. This is an objective you'll see on all of our funding calls. That we want any project we fund to develop evidence-based recommendations, and that'll be something we work together with so that we make sure those are targeted to decision makers. And we want recommendations about how policies, services and collaborations can better support prevention and identification of child trafficking. So that's it for the objectives. In terms of this particular call, we're interested in funding 2 projects, and the reason for that is because we would like 2 sort of complementary methodological approaches to be taken. The first one of those is a desk-based research evidence review, including potentially survey of practitioners or service providers, and that's sort of not necessarily including children and young people. That's about professionals in this sector and understanding their perceptions and what they think works. And then the second one is a more qualitative participatory approach, which is where we really want to see excellent inclusion of young people in the research itself through any sort of qualitative participatory method that might be appropriate. So we decided to go for 2 projects instead of 1, partly because of the complexity of conducting both of those different types of projects. But secondly, we'd like to have a diverse group of researchers involved, and we feel that it could be of benefit to have 2 separate projects that, of course, speak to each other and complement each other. So we really welcome applications that can involve people with lived experience in the most appropriate and ethical way, considering all relevant safeguards are in place. So that's the early identification and prevention of child trafficking. The second project is on cultural competency. So I'll just now spend a few minutes going through that call. So this is about, as it suggests, the value of more and better appreciation of cultural issues when delivering services or when interfacing with people at risk of modern slavery. So this is about improving our understanding of the value of cultural competency in legal enforcement. So that might mean the police or other enforcement agencies, and then also how services are delivered to potential and actual victims of modern slavery. So we've heard through previous research about poor practice and potential barriers to engagement with people from different communities because of that lack of cultural competency. Conversely, we've heard that initiatives that prioritize cultural competency and improve it do have better results. So we would like to have some evidence to support that and to improve cultural competency in relation to modern slavery. So research could look at both services and law enforcement's initial and ongoing engagement with survivors, but we would expect teams to partner with at least one community-led or community-engaged organisation due to this subject matter. So again, slides 1 and 2 here on objectives. The first one is that one I've already mentioned, which all of our projects should address, which is, please, if you're considering a project for the Modern Slavery PEC, think about how you can produce evidence that will help derive recommendations for policymakers. So that goes without saying. Then objective B is a desk-based review of existing evidence, thinking about initiatives that are currently trying to improve cultural competency or have already assessed or are evaluating interventions that are provided in a culturally safe way, looking at what the benefits are, what the risks are with developing interventions or initiatives that improve cultural competency. So this mapping of existing provision helps us to understand barriers, it helps us to understand gaps, where things are working well, where things are working not so well. And this is similar to other projects. If you're interested in previous work done by the Modern Slavery PEC, that there's a sort of combination of mapping of existing practice, but also doing some analytical work in terms of understanding why some things are working better than others. So a sort of realist evaluation approach where we include desk-based work with some engagement with professionals and others, particularly those with lived experience who are receiving these services. So the second slide on objectives is about that inclusion of multiple perspectives. So we want to include the perspectives of stakeholders and those with lived experience in terms of what's working in current approaches, and also in a two-way sense, what's working in terms of helping those directly affected understand services that are available and engaging and making use of those services appropriately. So ideally, this project would then help produce evidence-based principles. So to using the evidence that they gather to understand and analyze that to develop principles for culturally competent work that is specific to modern slavery practice in the UK. So that's it. The last one there is a desirable objective, which is looking at behavioral attitudinal change following training. And that's something that we are keen to look at, but we understand that not all teams have those sort of behavioral science skills. So we put that as desirable because it would be good for us if we could prove how effective training is by looking at behavior change. So that's it from me. I'll now pass back to Izzy, who will tell you a bit about the application process.
Thanks very much, Alex. So now I'm going to just talk through some of the sort of logistics and some reflections we have on our application process. So to start off with, just going through the timeline. So the deadline for applications this call is the 6th of April at 4 p.m. UK time. Applications need to be put through our submit platform, which you can see the link there, and the link's also on the call webpage. And we can't accept any late applications to this funding call. So just make sure you leave plenty of time for any institutional approvals that you need in order to get that through. Start speaking with your finance team now about putting budgets together, etc., just so you've got things ready ahead of time, and make sure you leave plenty of time if you need to ask us any questions ahead of that deadline. Obviously, we'll be very responsive on email in the week running up to it, but just make sure you leave us plenty of time if you think you might need us to answer any questions. We'll be going through the decision-making process throughout April. So our aim will be to inform teams on the outcome of the application in late April, potentially tipping into early May, and looking to have projects starting in June of this year. And once projects have started, there's sort of really 3 phases to working on a project with the Modern Slavery PEC. So the first phase is all about your project setup. So it's getting all the contracts ironed out, finalising your research questions and collaborating with the PEC on those, looking at your research tools, so your survey questions, literature review parameters, and sort of working with the PEC on those, and getting any ethics approvals that are needed. And so that's sort of that first phase that will be taking place in June. Then the next phase is when you'll sort of take things away and undertake the research, checking in with the PEC, giving us any interim findings, us doing sort of planning around policy impact. And then the final phase of work is sort of where you're writing up the findings of your research into your full report and research summaries, and working closely with colleagues at the PEC to disseminate those as widely as possible and to the relevant policy actors. All projects funded under this call need to finish by December of 2023. Unfortunately, we don't have that much flexibility around that due to our funding restrictions. So that's just something to consider when you're putting an application together, to make sure that it's going to be really realistic and feasible within these timeframes. And that's something that we'll be looking at the panel as well. So before I get on to the technical sort of eligibility, it's just some advice for putting in a strong application. So I think the main piece of advice I give to everyone is to use clear and concise language. Our panels at the Modern Slavery PEC are, they consist of a range of different backgrounds. So we have academics on our panels, but we also have individuals with lived experience of modern slavery, individuals with a policy expertise, or those come from an NGO background. So you just need to explain everything that you're putting into your application really clearly. There's always acronyms that come up that then confuse the panel. So just make sure that you're expanding on all of your technical language and that your application is really clearly written. The next piece of advice that tends to come up from panel is to make sure you justify the choices that are made in your application. So, for example, if you're looking at narrowing the scope of your research to a certain cohort or geographical location, that's absolutely fine to do so, and especially in these smaller projects, I would say it can be encouraged. but just make sure you're justifying why you have chosen to do that. Is that because you have particular connections in that region that will mean you can get really rich data from a certain cohort? Is it because of the practicalities around time? It's okay to sort of make quite practical justifications for choices in applications to the PEC, because we are aware of the time frame that this research needs to happen in. Or it might be that you think this particular cohort could really be scaled up to recommendations that apply to a larger group. Just make sure that you're justifying all of those choices throughout the application, because those are sorts of questions that tend to come up in panel. And the final piece of advice would be around demonstrating collaboration with your partners that are involved in the bid. As I go through the eligibility, I'll sort of cover that you need to collaborate. And as Alex has touched on already, that's one of our sort of real key ways of working at the Modern Slavery PEC. So if you have a partner who has a certain speciality in an area of your methodology, really tell us about that and really collaborate with them in putting together that application, and that should really come through to the panel. That's something that we always look for. So next, getting on some of the more technical aspects of the application process. So in terms of eligibility for this call, projects need to be based at either a UK higher education institution, so a university, an approved research organisation that's eligible to receive UKRI funding, or a charity that's registered in the UK that has a focus on modern slavery. All project teams need to include some level of collaboration between an academic or researcher and a third sector organisation, and that is really key. So if you are a charity that's looking to lead on a bid, you need to make sure you're collaborating with an academic, and vice versa. If you're an academic, you need to make sure you find a third sector organisation to collaborate with. If you can't demonstrate that collaboration in your application, it won't go to panel for assessment, because that is really key to our eligibility criteria. So just make sure that's really clear. Think about that for your budget. Think about that in terms of who's written in your research team, and demonstrate that to us really clearly. So throughout the core documentation, you'll see some different terminology in there, including principal and co-investigators. So I thought I'd just spend a bit of time explaining what that means. A principal investigator is the lead researcher in a project. They have project management responsibility, and ultimately that's the individual who's responsible to the Modern Slavery PEC to ensure that the work is completed. They'll be based at the lead organisation, and when we say principal investigator, we really just mean lead researcher. And then project teams will also have co-investigators. So those are researchers who work with the lead researcher on specific areas of the project. So it's really important to demonstrate from the project team who's doing what and why they're the best placed person to do that part of the project. Projects will also have partners involved in it as well. So that's somebody who's maybe not doing a research function. And if you have any questions around sort of how you should structure your team, I'd recommend dropping us an email, because it tends to be easier to answer that with a bit more context around how you're planning to put your project team together. So if you are going to be a principal investigator or a co-investigator in a project, it's just important to be aware that you can only be involved in a maximum of 2 applications to this funding call, and you can only be a principal investigator once. So you could be a principal investigator on, for example, a cultural competency application, and you could be a co-investigator on a prevention and identification of children application. Can't be a principal investigator twice, or you could be a co-investigator twice. But we're trying to sort of ensure that we've got good diversity over the projects that we fund, so that's why we have this limit in place. But this limit only applies to individuals. It doesn't apply to an organisation. So if at your research organisation, for example, at your university, if there were several academics who all wanted to apply for projects, that's absolutely fine. You only need to worry about that limit as an individual. In terms of the funding that's available, there's a maximum budget of £100,000 per project at 100% full economic cost. Again, you'll see full economic cost coming up throughout our documentation. Basically, what that means for those who aren't sort of day-to-day working in research funding is that that's the full amount that has to be spent. The reason why it's important is because higher education institutions and approved research organisations receive their funding at 80% of the full economic cost. So for every pound that's spent, they're reimbursed 80 pence, whereas UK-based third sector organisations receive all of their funding from the Modern Slavery PEC at 100%. So for every pound you spend, we'll reimburse you by a pound. If it's something you're not familiar with, don't worry about it too much. This is really standard in research funding. So research organisations will be used to costing their budgets in this way. So don't worry about it too much, but that's why that terminology is used. We expect to fund 6 projects across this call. So as we mentioned already, it'll probably be 1 on cultural competency and 2 on children, as Alex outlined earlier, and then 3 across the other projects that are in the funding call. And we'll be doing this sort of with a portfolio consideration. And the final thing to consider around funding here is that UK-based third sector organisations can apply for up to 50% of the project budget. So I'll just go through now a couple of examples of how budgets might be put together. So you can see here in these 2 scenarios, which, sorry if they're a little bit small, this is also available to download via the call webpage. The first example that we have here has a university that is receiving 55% of the budget, and then 2 charity partners that between them are receiving the other 45%. So that's eligible because the charity partners are under that 50% threshold. In the second scenario we have, there are 2 universities involved. They're receiving 50% of the budget, and then 2 charity partners involved. They're receiving the other 50%. That is also completely eligible, so going up to that 50% of the budget. If you have any budget queries, please feel free to drop an email to us about those specifically. They can get quite complicated. We try to keep it as simple as possible, but we're always happy to answer any questions about specific projects. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. So please do put questions into the queue.